Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of our Seven Investing Podcast. I'm Seven Investing founder and CEO Simon Erickson, and today we're going to be talking about drug developers. There's a trend that's developing out there right now, personalized medicine, and there's a flood of interest in companies that are creating new drugs based on innovative new technologies. But as an investor, how can we actually hope to value these companies that are so early in their life cycle, often before they even have any revenue whatsoever? And to answer questions like those, I'm so glad to be joined by my Seven Investing colleague, our lead advisor, Max Chatsko. Max, I know that you follow the life sciences industry pretty closely. It's kind of nice to be chatting with you here on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks. I just started digging into all this stuff, but this is a good way to maybe quantify, what is a drug worth? What's this pipeline worth? And, there's still models, but I think it'll get you pretty close to a good answer.
Perfect. Well, maybe my first question is to start at that 10,000 foot level, right? Because so much of investing, at least in mature industries and mature companies, is valuation multiples, right? It's price of revenue, price of cash flow, price of earnings, whatever it might be. That doesn't really apply when you're dealing with a pre-commercial drug developer. What is this space like? What are the companies in the areas that you look at tend to look like?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? If we have a tech company, you have some revenue, and even if it's not profitable, you can, use discounted cash flow models or look out years into the future and say, you know what, this is going to be worth this much, maybe, even if the premiums come down. So this is like has a good value, right? It's growing quickly, maybe margins are expanding. In drug development, we don't have that, right? And in pre-commercial drug developers, I should clarify, they don't have revenue, they don't have earnings, they don't have cash flow. They might have revenue from milestone payments, but it's not recurring revenue. They don't have product sales, right, every quarter. So the way that these are, it can be, it seems like a black box, right? How is this valued at $3 billion? It has a couple assets in phase 1 clinical trials that are one in phase 2. And how do we even arrive at what's a fair valuation? What if none of it works? And the way that the industry does this, both drug developers and also Wall Street analysts, is they build these net present value models. So each, drug in the pipeline will have a value assigned to it based on the probability that it reaches market, which means it has a probability of generating cash flows in the future. So it looks very similar to some of these, discounted cash flow models that investors might be more familiar with, but we just tweak it a little bit with some metrics that are unique and inherent to drug development, and that's how it works.
So let's dig a little bit more into those models because I think that's important, as a valuation tool for this space. Quarterly earnings probably are not as important for these kinds of companies as a result of data from their clinical trials that they have ongoing. We oftentimes, Max, see these companies can pop, 30%, 50%, sometimes even more than 100% in their stock prices in a single day. Why is there so much volatility in these, and how does that relate to these models you're talking about?
Yeah, so earnings are not very important in terms of the quarterly updates, right? And a lot of companies now in the header of the press release will just say business update. Here's our Q1 business update because they don't, what are their earnings going to tell you? Really nothing. And when they do have data or maybe a partnership or a regulatory event, we do see some of these big pops. Or sometimes if the data are not good, we can see the stock crater as well. And that leads to this perception that, trading or I'm sorry, investing in, these stocks is binary, right? These are binary events. For the 7 years it takes to develop a drug, only 5 days might really matter for any single asset. And we have these big spikes or big drops. And that's partly true. But what really is happening is when data are released, all of those models on Wall Street are getting updated with that new information. So that's what causes these to be binary. It's really when the models are updated, right? And that's because it's so challenging to really get a good hold on, what's a fair valuation for some of these companies, especially if they're in new areas, right? I mean, think about like gene editing. We don't have any historical data for what's the success rate of a gene editing, or maybe some new cell therapies. We have no idea. So those can tend to be a little bit more volatile. So one of the most important metrics is probability of success. Do you know what that is, Simon?
I've heard it before. POS, Max. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, so probability of success is really like the most important metric that goes into these net present value calculations. And from what I found, there's a couple different flavors. So there's just straight up net present value calculations. And then there's also something called risk adjusted net present value calculations. So we abbreviate that with a lowercase r and then capital NPV. Those tend to be a little bit more accurate during development itself. Both of these NPV and rNPV can arrive at the same numbers at the end, but that could be years away. So as investors, it's maybe good to check in throughout development. So I would like to use risk-adjusted net present value. And the difference is risk-adjusted net present value takes into account that an asset can get de-risked. So it has a higher probability of success as it advances through each stage of development. So in the last decade, from 2011 to 2020, a drug that entered phase 1 clinical trials had a 7.9% chance of reaching the market. So that was the overall probability of success for any drug candidate in the entire industry. Now you can get very granular with this, and this is how more accurate models are built. So you can look at specific therapeutic areas. So that number changes drastically depending on the area, the diseases that you're treating. So for oncology drugs, only 5.3% that entered phase 1 clinical trials reached the market in the last decade. But if you look at hematology, so blood disorders, that number jumps to 23.9%. So in different areas, they have different amounts of risk or different likelihoods of success. And sometimes, for oncology, I mean, there's a lot of smaller drug developers as well, right? So there's more drugs. So N, the number of total drugs being looked at and in that calculation is much larger. And some of those maybe aren't going to be successful to begin with. Smaller drug developers rarely, under a certain market cap, I think it's under $300 million, rarely get a cancer drug approved. So they might be, closer to 0%. But you can kind of get the idea. So with probability of success, we calculate that by looking at the phase-to-phase transition rates. So for any drug in the industry, we'll go back to just 10,000-foot view. So we'll say 100 drugs enter clinical trials, right? Phase 1. Out of those, only 52 are actually going to make it to phase 2 clinical trials. So it's a pretty small number. And then of those drugs, only 28.9% are actually going to reach phase 3. So most drugs actually fail in phase 2 clinical trials. And this makes sense. So it's kind of like the valley of death, I guess you would say, for drug development, right? Phase 1 clinical trials, we're trying to optimize dosing. We're getting some early signals about safety and efficacy. Not too many big hurdles to jump over. Phase 2, we're asking deeper questions, more detailed questions, right? We want some clear signals of efficacy. We really want to get a good handle on safety. There's more patients involved. And of course, if a drug developer is not sure about the success, then it might just have it makes a go, no go decision. Do we want to move this into phase 3? Because that's going to be several more years of development and a lot more money invested as well. So a lot of assets don't make it out of phase 2. And then if you make it to phase 3, it's about a coin flip overall for the whole industry of whether or not it's actually going to be approved. So anyway, probability of success is really one of the most important metrics that goes into these risk-adjusted net present value calculations.
Yeah, there's a lot of good insight in that, Max. I want to double click on a couple of those things you said first, but kind of to frame up everything. The NPV, the net present value calculations are, since we don't have current revenues, we have the promise of something potentially being commercialized in the future. We think that it might be worth this much in sales. We start at the future. We say, if we actually get this to go commercial and get approved, this is what it looks like. We discount those back to the present value and can incorporate kind of our probability of success in there in the middle of how likely is it that we actually get there. But then that current value of the asset summed across all of the assets that a company has in development right now is kind of a decent proxy for what we think the company is worth. Is that a fair assessment of what we're doing here?
Yes. And, again, these are imperfect models, and they're all estimates. No one actually knows the probability of success for any single drug candidate. We can use historical averages all day long, but some are going to have much higher. Some are going to have no chance at all. So, combining that with maybe a technical understanding of a specific drug class or a therapeutic modality, or what makes a company's approach maybe have a little bit more de-risked compared to the industry average, that can go a long way. And again, we're also using, what are the cash flows going to be? So we're kind of estimating peak sales, which can have a large delta. You could be off. or maybe significantly underestimate as well. And again, drug development takes a very long time, right? Many years. I think we're starting to see that kind of accelerate. So we're seeing drugs be developed in shorter time frames. I think the rule of thumb used to be about 10 years, but we're seeing that come down quite a bit. And maybe 5 to 7 might be more accurate nowadays. And of course, if you have a really good drug asset and it gets accelerated approval pathways or breakthrough therapy designation, maybe you can get to market even sooner. But again, that long time frame in years affects your discount rate. So you need a much higher discount rate to make up for, how long you have to wait and all of the risks involved as well. So actually one example though of, how it can go wrong or how these are all models. So again, we said like when data come out for a company, that can have a big effect on the share price one way or the other. And that's because all those models are getting updated on a single day. This is also true for when a drug developer, like a larger drug developer, is going out and making an acquisition. It might apply a higher probability of success for a pipeline or a pipeline asset that it's acquiring. And that's part of where that premium comes from. So it's using like a higher probability of success than maybe Wall Street was factoring in. So it's a good example. In 2014, Johnson & Johnson went out and acquired Covagen, and it had an anti-TNF bispecific antibody. So anti-TNF is what Humira is based on, right? So big cash cow is right now the best-selling drug in the world. So Johnson & Johnson said, give us some of that. And they applied a probability of success to this asset. It was in phase 1 clinical trials of 26%. So they thought it had a 1 in 4 chance of reaching the market. And everyone else basically had about a 15% probability of success tagged on to that. So that is an example of why that premium got applied, right? Johnson & Johnson in their own internal models said, hey, you know what? We feel pretty good about this, or better than everyone else. We're going to go gobble this up. Now, Johnson & Johnson is the largest company in the world, right? So it has more cash to throw around, and it has more data, of course, right? It has a lot of scientists, a lot of really smart people working there. And actually, this drug failed in clinical development. So Johnson & Johnson acknowledged that, right? It said a 1 in 4 chance of reaching the market, but it did fail due to safety reasons in later stage development. So this is a good example that, how imperfect these are. And this is really just used to maybe help add a little quantification to biotech investing. And it's a good reminder as well. I mean, there's calculators that anybody can use online. But if you're going in there and plugging in numbers that are unrealistically high, and as you might have, reasoned from the probability of success is 7.9% for any drug in the last decade. Even 20% in the wrong area is like unrealistically high, right? So if you're just slapping in these high percentages and you get a really high number for what this stock might be worth, chances are you're probably going to be wrong. So these can be very dangerous in the wrong hands as well. So just a word of caution if you're playing around with some of these online calculators. Johnson & Johnson can be wrong. Most of us are going to be wrong too most of the time, right?
Fair enough. Yes, buyer beware when you're using those online calculators to figure out the success of a drug. It's interesting though, Max. I mean, you mentioned that they're kind of the role of big pharma in all of this. J&J and the other guys that have a lot of deep pockets that kind of puts a floor maybe on a lot of these new drug developers. I know that Aswath Damodaran, who is kind of this legendary professor of finance at NYU years ago, was looking at the returns on investment for big pharma companies. For them to just go out and pursue innovative science completely from the ground up, like you said, those single-digit chances of success, probability of success in phase 1, versus to let those assets go through trials, let the smaller companies develop them on their own, and then go ahead and purchase them in later stages. And his conclusion was for big pharma, it actually was more advantageous from a profitability perspective and for an investor's returns perspective to wait, to let these companies grow on their own and then buy them up when they're later and there's a higher probability of success. And so I think that's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So, larger companies, there's like this weird, once a drug developer has enough success, it's generating a lot of revenue. Maybe it has a valuation in the tens of billions of dollars. Well, at a certain point, those drugs are kind of fading, right? They're losing market share. Maybe they're losing patent protection. And these successful drug developers kind of hit a wall. And they have to start really nailing their development to replace those lost revenues. And it's tough to grow further beyond a certain level. So you see them, they do turn to acquisitions. And we saw, in the last decade with, remember the patent cliff was a big worry, maybe 10 years ago now, geez. And so there's a lot of big acquisitions, right? All the major drug developers are trying to stock their pipelines with new assets, new pipeline technologies. And a lot of those didn't really work out so well. Like you said, with that analysis, maybe we can tweet that out or something. Maybe a little dated now, but I think the points are still valid. Yeah, it does help to maybe look at later stage assets because they are more de-risked, and that's why later stage drug developers, even if they don't have a drug on the market, tend to have a higher valuation. Right? We have a little bit more assurance that they are going to be successful, or at least they have a higher chance of success.
So on that note, and while I have you here, Max, I want to make sure that we talk about the science, the foundational science of all of this, right? I think that one of my things I've really enjoyed with having you on the 7 investing team is that you're so far ahead of so many other investors and analysts out there, and really digging into the science and what's going on out there. And so let's talk about IP, because this industry is built upon patents. Like you said, you get 2 decades of exclusive rights to a certain molecule that you develop or a certain science that you have in your IP war chest. But you also mentioned that kind of there's a difference between more established technology that's out there that people are building upon and that scientists understand versus the stuff that's really, really cutting edge, right? We talked just about Humira, right? For rheumatoid arthritis, anti-inflammatory drugs, pretty well understood. There's different variations of that. And even AbbVie is developing its kind of next wave of replacements for Humira now. Versus something that's much more cutting edge, right? We're seeing all of these kind of oncology drugs, these personalized medication drugs. I mean, even Alzheimer's has been talked about with Biotech, the uncurable disease with a very, very low, if not near zero probability of success, at least historically. As an investor, are you more drawn to the more established science that's a little bit more understood by the industry with a higher probability of success? Or do you want to go out there and swing for the fences, knowing it's a less chance of actually getting commercialized, but there's a huge reward because it's so competitive and challenging to do? Or is it somewhere in the middle of those and it's not a rule of thumb one way or the other for you?
I would say it's not a rule of thumb, but you are correct in that, as we said, I think a lot of the value of biotech investing, where you might beat Wall Street or beat the market, is by getting to those opportunities faster, discovering those before Wall Street does, right? Now, again, that's still challenging. But in terms of, do I want to play around and give more attention to newer therapeutic modalities versus those that are established? I think it's a little mix of both. So something that I've drawn to is I think, genetic medicines are going to have a higher probability of success across the board. So like RNA interference was kind of the first to get there. And they're picking now well-defined targets, at least as far as going to the liver is considered. And Alnylam has data that their probability of success for an asset in phase 1 is 60%. So that's like, almost 10 times the industry average. So RNAi directed to the liver for a well-defined genetic target is just money in the bank. Now, I actually think this is probably going to be true for other genetic medicines. We just saw with CRISPR gene editing, of course, right? Intellia had just crushed it on its preliminary phase 1 results, but that demonstrated that they can rationally design something that's going to go into the liver, knock out a gene of interest it's actually one of the same ones that Alnylam went after. So it's a validated genetic target. And it knocked it out of the park, right? So I think that kind of proves that we can probably design similar assets for other genetic targets using
real,
that.
Real quick, was that pun intended? Knocking it out of the park for the knockout gene editing? I caught on that, Max. It might have been subtle.
I'm talking to Matt too much lately, I guess. His dad jokes are wearing off. But yeah, so I think, and if you design those well and they're very selective, you're going after a specific mRNA transcript or a specific gene, then there shouldn't really be any side effects, right? So that kind of changes the game a little bit where, traditionally we design these, small molecule inhibitors in cancer, and it might have activity against a specific target, but it might also whack like half a dozen other things. And that's where side effects come from. You're targeting something that's the tumor's making, but you're also accidentally having activity against really important proteins, in someone's gastrointestinal tract. And that's why they have like nausea or vomiting or diarrhea. And sometimes they have to discontinue treatment altogether. So it makes sense that like very well rationally designed genetic medicines, because they're going so far upstream, right? DNA and RNA, that's as far as you can go, are going to have very high probabilities of success. And I think if we make more selective drugs as well against any target, right, that's kind of where it is. They should have higher probabilities of success. So, I don't care what the therapeutic modality is, but the underlying technology platform, if that can de-risk drug development sooner, design more selective drugs, I think that's really what it comes down to.
And two more questions for you here, Max. The first is, our audience, obviously individual investors who might be interested in this space. It sounds like there's a lot of risk inherent with these types of companies. How would you recommend investors approach investing in biotech, knowing that you have to be comfortable with a lot of these risks you just mentioned?
I'm sorry, can you say that again? You're quiet there at the end.
How would you recommend an individual investor approach investing in biotech companies, knowing that there's a lot of risks that are on the table?
Yeah. So, well, my approach is, I guess there's two approaches, right? So this is how I explain it. You can have a top-down approach. So you just say, hey, gene therapy, I think is going to be big. I'm going to go buy a basket of gene therapy stocks. And that way you're spreading risk across a therapeutic modality. And, some of those are going to succeed very successful, be very successful. Some are going to fail, but hopefully the winners make up for the losers, right? I do a bottom-up approach. So I try to understand an area really thoroughly, right? At the ground level. I read a lot of scientific literature, very boring. Try to understand what are the challenges of a new technology, because nothing's perfect. And then also, what are the opportunities? How can this be used? Where does it make sense? Where does it not make sense? And then I look at the competitive landscape. So I try to understand all the companies that are in this space. And then I'll try to narrow it down to 1, 2, 3 companies. I'll read through the SEC filings, see how their commercial strategy stacks up. And sometimes I don't make any investment or any recommendation. Sometimes there just isn't anything there, right? So I don't force it. But, every once in a while, you're like, oh, this is the company in this specific space. So that's my bottom-up approach. So, yeah, look, inherently, it is risky. Even if we have more accurate models than Wall Street, again, probably the success overall is pretty low. So it's going to be really hard to avoid the losers and the failures, right? That's just part of how the space operates. But this is similar for all investing in any industry, Simon, right? Your winners usually dictate your portfolio's returns and more than make up for your losers. So there's ways to constrain risk. And I think my framework over the years has proven that. And I'm really happy to dig in. I'm starting to look into these, risk-adjusted net present value calculations, a new tool in my toolkit. I think I can increase my success levels even higher. So.
Perfect. And then my last question, Max, while I have you here, is what are those ponds that you're fishing in? Can you give me two developing technologies being used for drug development that you're really interested in, you're taking a closer look at right now?
Two technologies being used. I really am interested in bispecific antibodies. So traditionally, we have antibodies that go in, they have one target that they are active against. A bispecific antibody can attach to 2 targets simultaneously. So sometimes it can be used to stimulate the immune system and also have anti-cancer activity as well. So they can attach to a tumor. So if they can attach to a tumor and an immune cell, they can bring the immune cell to the tumor. Now, we're still figuring all this out. There's a lot of interest here, but and they can go very wrong. There's a lot of when it doesn't work, there's a lot of side effects. It's not very good for patients. But we are seeing when they're rationally designed, they can have they have similar efficacy and similar safety to some of these cell therapies, right? Like CAR T or even natural killer cells. They're a lot easier to manufacture. We know how to make antibody drugs, right? Way easier to make than cell therapies. Easier to administer a lot of times. These can be used subcutaneously, where sometimes you need to go to have an infusion for a cell therapy, so you have to go to a special center that can handle that. And right now, it depends again on what targets you're going after, but they can also be dosed multiple times in certain settings. So that's another potential advantage it has over some of these cell therapies. But cell therapies, I think, we just got to engineer those a little bit better. But that would be another area I'm very interested in. There's a lot of cool companies out there. I think next-gen CAR T, if we can get around some of those side effects that are worrisome. Natural killer cells look pretty good as well, right? They seem to avoid all of the 3 major side effects of CAR T. And then there's a lot of newer and different therapeutic modalities and cell therapies using different cells. There's companies that want to just engineer your cells in your body. So we don't have to manufacture them. We'll just edit them as they are to maybe fix or treat or cure disease. So really interested in how we can affect disease at the cellular level. So biospecific antibodies and a whole basket of cell therapies I'm really interested in.
Sounds like some good stuff to keep an eye on. Really exciting space here, Max. And not only from an investing angle, but also in the terms of saving people's lives and the good that it's going to do for society as a whole. I really like your technical approach. I'm really looking forward to learning more about how we value these types of companies. Thanks very much for being on the podcast here this morning.
Yeah, thanks. We'll have to do an update whenever I see how my models are doing, or maybe we'll walk through one.
Absolutely. Part 2 to come still in the future with Max Chatsko talking about biotech and drug development. If you'd like to hire Max to find some really interesting biotech companies and some drug developers out there, you can do so by signing up with 7 Investing today. In fact, as this will be published, we'll have less than 36 hours left to lock in our current rates of only $17 a month or $170 a year. We're going to be increasing that on July the 8th, so take advantage of the opportunity at 7investing.com/subscribe to sign up today, get access to all of Max's official recommendations. In fact, you get access to all 7 of our monthly official 7 investing recommendations each and every month. Thanks very much for joining us on this episode of our 7 Investing Podcast. We are here to empower you to invest in your future. We are 7 Investing.